Today is 10:31. As you can see, it's Halloween. I'm Electric Smurf. And this is Mr. Dwyer and the ladies that are interviewing him for the Veterans History Project. Ladies, would you like to introduce yourselves, please?
I'm Monica Higgins, Gail Kmetch, Jericho Morgan.
Great, thank you. And proceed on. Thank you.
So do you have questions you want to ask me, or should I just talk?
You can start off by talking first and then we'll
Okay. So I wanted to give you just an idea of where Vietnam was located. Soviet Union's up here, China down here is Vietnam, right along the coast. And I was stationed in the country of Thailand. So we'll flip back here. And up here is a town called Korat. And there was an Air Force base there, which is now gone. But Korat Air Force Base is where I was stationed for a year, from April of '72 to April '73. And I flew C-130 aircraft. And our missions were very long, 16 hours. We take off from Korat and fly over to Laos. And you might say, what are you doing over Laos? The war is in Vietnam. But the enemy, or the Vietnamese, had what they called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It ran down through Laos, through Cambodia, and into South Vietnam. And that's how the North Vietnamese supplied their soldiers in South Vietnam, mainly via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You couldn't see that trail because of the jungle. You know, the jungles have canopies, so you couldn't really see what was going on down there. Do you ladies, you know something about the Vietnam War? It was North against the South, and
Yeah.
okay. And so the mission of my airplane was to basically just get on the other side of this Mekong River and fly back and forth in a big, like, racetrack, and like the length of the oval on the racetrack was probably something like 150 miles. And so we were in the southern part of Laos, and there was another plane in the northern part of Laos doing the same thing, flying over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And our airplanes had sort of two missions. One was, well, they were both part of what they called the electronic battlefield, which we thought was really cool back in those days. What the Air Force did is they flew low over the trail as best they could find it, in jet airplane, little jets, and dropped these special radios that came down, and they had a rod in the bottom, and they stick that rod would go into the earth and pick up any vibrations, and then the radio would send a signal up to our airplane, and we would basically just intercept that radio signal and amplify it, and we sent it over to another Air Force base in eastern Thailand, which I forget where it was located exactly. And there, yeah, I think it was here at, does that say Udorn? Yeah, I think it was in Udorn. They had a computer there even in the early 70s, it wasn't like a PC, but it was some type of high-powered government computer that could interpret those vibrations from those little radios and tell you whether that was a man walking, or an ox, or a truck, or a man on a bicycle, and so that you could try and figure out if you had a military target down there. And somehow it must have given the coordinates for this use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So anyway, they would figure out that there's a target in some sort of general area. And then they would send in a forward air controller, who was another Air Force guy in a very small putt-putt type of airplane flying a tree just above the trees. And he would go in there and try to see what's moving and really get it finally located, precisely located. And he would be in radio contact with a full bird colonel who was in the back of my airplane. And the full bird is in the back, and this is a big airplane. And if you picture it like in this room, this side of the airplane, you know, where passengers would be sitting in a normal aircraft, was just a wall covered with big maps of Laos, Vietnam, and whatever. And so the forward air controller, right down close to the ground, would call up and say, I've got a target at such and such coordinates. And then an enlisted man would plot the target on the map. And the colonel, after a whole bunch of targets get plotted on the map, the colonel can see what's going on. And then he calls for fighter aircraft, which are over Thailand. And the fighters, there are probably 5 or 6 of them, and they're in another orbit, just flying around behind a KC-135, which was a tanker. And the tanker, of course, carries fuel for air-to-air refueling, because the fighters don't carry an awful lot of fuel. So they get the fighters topped off all the time, and as soon as the colonel called for a fighter, these guys would take off, and the colonel would give them the general area to go to, and then the fighters would switch their radios to talk to the forward air controller, and the forward air controller then would fire a little smoke grenade or something out of his airplane, maybe south of the target, usually not on the target. They didn't want to try to give too much warning. They dropped the smoke some distance away, and then the forward air controller tells the fighter to drop your bombs 50 meters north of the smoke, something like that. And so that's how they tried to fight the North Vietnamese on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the United States Air Force had those 2 C-130 aircraft going up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's why our missions were so long. We had to take off from Karat. I think it took like an hour and a half to fly out there and relieve the other C-130. We would go back. Then we'd spend our 12 hours or whatever on in the racetrack going back and forth. And for me personally, it was a very soft assignment. We had, you get up there and you'd get where you belonged, and You could sip coffee and just watch the beautiful countryside go by beneath you. We were very full of fuel. We had to take every bit of fuel we could in order to stay up for 16 hours. And because of that, we had to try and conserve our fuel to make it last a long time. So we couldn't immediately climb to like 30,000 feet to try and get out of range of the soldiers on the ground. We had to climb up really slowly, so we'd usually get there, we'd be, I think, around 12,000 feet. And slowly, as we burned off fuel and became lighter, we'd climb and climb, and by the end of the day, we'd be up around, I think, 35,000 feet, and out of the range of most of the enemy's weapons. So that's kind of like what I did. Any questions or anything you'd like to be curious about?
Hard to stay in touch with your family.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we had mail. It took a couple of weeks, I think, to get a letter back and forth in those days. From time to time, we would coordinate with our wives and say, okay, I'm going to try and call you at a specific time, and you'd have to make this arrangements by letter. And then you'd go to a special place on the Air Force Base, and they would patch you through. You'd be holding a telephone, but they'd patch you through by way of shortwave radio operators. And you always had a horrible connection, you know, you could barely hear. And I think I only called home like twice. Recently, our oldest son, Brady, was stationed in Afghanistan, and he could just whip open his cell phone and call us, and it sounded like he was right around the corner. So it's amazing the progress they've made, the electronics.
Why did you join the Air Force?
I joined the Air Force because I had a draft number of 34, and that meant that when I got out of college, I was definitely going to be drafted into the Army. So one day I was walking through the student union at college, and there was a poster up on the wall, and it showed this second lieutenant polishing the wing of this jet airplane, you know, this little cute little jet. I said, that looks pretty good. So I tried out for the Air Force, and they accepted me into the pilot training program. And so that's why I went in. I was sort of a draft dodger. And of course that war, speaking of draft dodging, that was a very unpopular war. You know, if you think of it, I mean, here's China. You'd think, well, China was communist. And were they supplying Vietnam? Because I mean, how could Vietnam, this little country, possibly stand up to the United States of America? Well, in fact, China and Vietnam were not at all friendly. The North Vietnamese were receiving all their weaponry from the Russians. And the Russians would just bring their ships into Haiphong Harbor and unload their weapons, you know, give them to the Vietnamese. But the United States military was not allowed to attack these ships, even though they're right there. You can see them. They're bringing in weapons. But because of the politics and the fear of escalation, you couldn't touch the Russians. And, you know, if you think about it, what kind of a war is that? I mean, if you want to defeat somebody, you have to defeat them. And of course, the politics did not allow us to invade North Vietnam. We could drop bombs all over the place, which we did. But we couldn't send our soldiers into North Vietnam.
Do you have any like really memorable experiences while in the war?
Well, couple. Yeah, we would listen on the radio to other pilots who were flying over North Vietnam. And one day we heard this Navy pilot get shot down. And then, you know, he's flying a small, probably an A6 or something like that, a small jet. And they fly in a pack of 5 or 6. And so, yeah, he got shot down, and we're listening on the radio to the other members of his flight squadron talking to each other and trying to determine exactly where he's landing. And the guy did parachute out, and they tried to establish exactly where he went down so that maybe some rescue effort could be made sometime, but I don't think it ever was. You know, the pilots who were shot down, if they lived, were kept in a prison up in Hanoi, which was the capital of North Vietnam. Another memorable experience was that some of the C-130s, I got a little picture of one here, were outfitted with miniguns. This is my certificate for the 1,000-hour club, because I flew more than 1,000 hours. And that's what a C-130 looks like from the front. You see them on TV every once in a while. The Air Force still uses them extensively. It's a great airplane. And so anyway, one night we're out there flying our racetrack, and a couple miles to the south there was a gunship C-130 and firing his minigun, and that thing was just unbelievable because it also shoots like tracers every 5th round or something like that, and it's like a stream of fire that just goes from that airplane down to the ground, and it was an awesome display of firepower. And let's see, one time we lost an engine, and not me, but the commander of the airplane decided to remain on duty, so to speak, over Laos, and we had to fly at a reduced altitude, and you know, dangerously within the fire of the enemy, and so for staying aboard the aircraft, they gave me the Distinguished Flying Cross, and this is the citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross. And that's a pretty good medal. George Bush Sr. received the Distinguished Flying Cross as well. And believe me, you're no superhero to get that, but it's a pretty nice decoration. So I brought mine to show you. No, that's the Air Medal. Yeah, I got some actually neat stuff here. That's the Distinguished Flying Cross. kind of cool, and they even put my initials on the back. And jammed up there somewhere. In any event, I hope that one of you ladies could figure that out for me. This medal was given to me by the government of Cambodia, and it was formerly known as the Khmer Republic, because once in a while, thank you, we would fly into Cambodia to drop bombs, but when we did that, we had to fly into Phnom Penh down here and pick up a Cambodian major, army major, and he would fly with the colonel in the back, and they had to approve any target before it could be bombed. In other words, the major had to sign off on it, the Cambodian major. This government, shortly after I received this medal from the government of Cambodia, that government fell to a group called the Khmer Rouge, who were horrible communists, and they made a movie called The Killing Fields. I don't know if you young people ever saw that, but they committed a tremendous massacre of teachers, lawyers, doctors, anybody with an education had to be exterminated, and they wanted to return the whole country to a purely agrarian culture. And that, of course, failed later. In fact, Vietnam went to war with the Khmer Rouge and defeated them years later. Getting back to my missions, they were, like I said, really soft. I would go up, I would fly for 4 hours while the chief pilot took a break, and then he'd fly for 4 hours, and I'd take a break. And back at the Air Force Base, Korat Air Force Base, I had air-conditioned quarters. I shared a room with one other pilot. You could get mixed drinks at the Officers Club for 25 cents. And for like $1.20, you could have a fabulous meal at the Officers Club. They had a pool. We had a maid that cleaned our room. It was really,
That's nice.
it was really something. For not everybody had that, you know. They tried to keep the pilots really happy, and so it was pretty soft way to go to war. I went down to the city of Bangkok many times to spend a weekend or a couple days down there. Fabulous city. I mean, tremendous restaurants and very nice people. Had a good time down there. When we were flying, we would often tune one of our radios to the North Vietnamese radio station, and we'd listen to someone who was known as Hanoi Hannah. And of course, she was always broadcasting propaganda, you know, telling us how our soldiers were getting creamed and everything, and she'd play a lot of Bob Dylan and Joan Baez records, and I liked Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, so I listened to that quite often. Pretty neat. Yeah. We had a few missions over Vietnam itself. We flew over the ancient city of Hue, H-U-E, which is in here somewhere. It was a huge battle there a few years before I got there, but it's a very famous place.
What was it like coming home?
It was great. My wife flew over, and we left from Bangkok and flew to Hong Kong and spent 4 or 5 days there, had a great time. Then we flew into San Francisco, and I'll never forget this. I'm coming in to San Francisco, and I'm on a civilian airliner, but I've got all my luggage with me, of course, and the customs official says to me, this is like 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I think my wife and I were like one of the few people in this special area or something, and this guy says to me, well, did you take advantage of our generous drug program while you were in Southeast Asia? I looked at him, didn't register what he was asking me. He's saying, are you bringing in any drugs? Because I'd heard stories, and of course I wasn't, but you could get, I understand, really pure heroin pretty cheap when we were over there. And somebody once told me that if you took a couple of D-cell batteries and took all the junk out of them and filled them up with heroin and brought those back, it'd be worth like $10,000 or something, which was a lot of money in those days. Still a lot of money. And getting home was good, yeah. My family, my mother and father and brothers and sisters at that time were living in a little place called Walton, New York. And yeah, we had a great homecoming. Nice little party for me.
What did you do as a career after?
After the war, I was stationed at Andrews Air Force Base, Washington, D.C., where I had another nice job of flying people mostly around the United States. We had like a couple of places that we flew to several times a week. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and then Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. And it was just like an airline. I mean, our airplane took off like every Wednesday morning and probably every Friday morning to go to those places. And they'd be shipping around a lot of officers. So yeah, the remainder of my 6.5 years in the service were at Andrews Air Force Base. And I had some really interesting missions. One time we flew to West Point and picked up like 30 cadets, and we took them up to a little place in Canada called Resolute Bay, which is 65 miles from the North Magnetic Pole. And we dropped these guys off so they could do their Arctic survival training. And from there, we couldn't spend the night there. It was just a gravel runway. So we flew over to Thule Air Force Base in Greenland. And that was one of the most beautiful sights I ever saw. We were flying in there just at dusk, and the sun is shining on the ocean and illuminating, making these icebergs like golden and orange. And as we flew into Thule, just really like beautiful. And then I had another mission where we went all over South America. As we were flying students from the National War College to all the capitals in South America. That was another trip of a lifetime. You spend 2 or 3 days in each place. I saw these really cool cities: Quito, Ecuador; Santiago, Chile; Ascension, Paraguay; Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay; let's see, where else did we go? Rio de Janeiro. Can you imagine? I got 3 days in Rio de Janeiro, 3 days in Brasilia, and 3 days in Manaus. I think all 3 of those are in Brazil. And and then 1 night in Curacao on the way home, which is a little island in the Caribbean. As I sit here and think about it, I had a really nice time in the Air Force. Okay.
Did you make a lot of friends, and if you did, are you still like in contact with them?
Only one guy am I still in contact with, and he got out of the service too. Jim Metzler. He is a lawyer in Rochester, and yeah, it's about the only guy really.
Did you attend any reunions?
No. No, as far as I know, we've never had any. Yeah.
You said Vietnam War wasn't a popular war. Since you were in the Air Force, when you came home, was it different? Like how people reacted?
Yeah. No, I didn't experience any sort of disrespect or anything like that. And I don't know of any, personally, I don't know of any incidents where friends of mine who served over there received any sort of disrespect. And I know that it's kind of a popular notion that GIs would come back and, you know, some protesters would spit on them. I really think that is an exaggeration of history. There were protesters who may have spat upon National Guardsmen who were trying to control a riot or something, but it's kind of like today. I mean, everyone says they support the troops, but we're in Iraq for the wrong reasons, and that's not a war that we're ever going to win, and we should get out of there. But nobody, holds anything against the individual soldiers. Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels between the Iraq War and Vietnam. In Vietnam, see, the regular soldiers of North Vietnam wore uniforms. But in the South, you had the Viet Cong, who did not wear any uniforms. They were guerrilla fighters, and you couldn't tell the enemy from a friendly, just like in Iraq. And soldiers were getting killed. Yeah, that's a significant similarity. Possibly just another little story about Vietnam. When I was over there, I talked to some fighter pilots, and they'd say, we'd go out on a mission, risk our lives to blow up some bridge. These were just little wooden bridges. You could get a truck across them. You blow them up. 3 days later, that bridge is right back there. The Vietnamese knew how to dig their tunnels. They hear the airplanes coming, they dive into their tunnels, survive the bombing, come right back out and rebuild those bridges. And they saw us as invaders, people who were trying to control them and that they weren't gonna have it. And there's a lot of that similar thinking, I believe, going on in Iraq. Anyway, very difficult to win the war when people don't want you there.
What medal is in this box?
This was this is the Air Medal, and I was awarded 2 of those. And when you get your second one, they don't give you another medal. You just get to wear an oak leaf cluster. When you've heard that term, you know. So this one down here, these are my ribbons. You know, when you wear your blue office uniform, you wear your ribbons. And this one down here, as you can see, the orange and the gold, this guy has the oak leaf cluster on it. I'm holding this upside down. There we go. That's the Distinguished Flying Cross.
Do you have any photos with you?
No, I don't.
No photos?
Tried to find one and it's lost somewhere.
Are you in any veteran organizations?
I belong to the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and I belong to the American Legion. And we march in a little parade on Veterans Day. We form up right behind Manja's in this parking lot. I guess it's actually more behind the bowling alley, a little farther down the street. And then we march up to that little park by Arthur's, which they've called Veterans Park. And then we also march in the parade on the 4th of July. The VFW also sponsors a competition called Voice of Democracy, which Mrs. Rossetti usually participates in. Rosati? Yeah. I don't know if the students like it, but you can win pretty good money. It's $150 for first prize.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that we didn't?
No, I hope I didn't talk too much.
No, you didn't.
No, okay.
Very informational. Thank you.
Good. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Good luck on your journalism project here.
Thanks. You grew up in Canton?
Canton, New York.
Did you like it there? I want to go to school there.
Do you?
Yeah, I want to go to school in Canton.
Okay, that's a great school, and yeah, if you do go there, and I don't know if you'd be interested to do this, but if I can remember his name, Brian. Yeah, I can't remember his name. He's in charge of the physical plant up there, you know, doing all the maintenance. Yeah, Canton's a great little town.
Yeah, my
Good.
boyfriend goes to Potsdam, and so I went up there this weekend and I saw it, so
Yeah,
it was nice.
yeah, it's a nice campus, right by the river and
Yeah.
everything, yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking about going. So you like it there?
Oh, yeah,
Good.
great town.